Welcome back, everybody. If I had to ask you what the difference is between hearing and listening, would you know? I asked my classes this just the other day, and they actually got the definitions of hearing and listening swapped in about 50% of the people. So I'm curious to see what you guys thought. Today, our topic is on Chapter 7, Talking and Listening. I think some of this is going to be a little bit repetitive, but we'll see where it takes us. Okay, so we are going to talk about types of conversations, self-disclosure, something called the social penetration theory, which I know, haha, sounds like a funny topic. I find it very interesting, so I hope you will too. Also a new topic called Johari window and the listening process, as well as types of listening responses. And I know what you're thinking, Carol, that sounds like a lot, but no, this is just, there are 12 slides total, so it just looks like a lot. We'll see how we make it through. Okay, as I said, we're going to start with the types of conversations. This visual is from our book, and it's got 4 quadrants. And so what we want to do is think about on the left-hand side of this quadrant, on the bottom left, it says, okay, so the 2 circles on the bottom represent one-way communication, and the 2 circles on the top represent two-way communication. And I'll explain each of those in a minute. On the left side, so the 2 circles on the left represent cooperative communication versus the 2 circles on the right represent competitive communication. So in the top left, we think of communication, it's called a dialogue when it's going both ways, both people are participating, and it's cooperative. So both people are participating and also they're sort of building off one another to create meaning. That's a dialogue. That is what we want to work towards. In most cases, for relationships that are important to us, the communication should be two-way and there should be a cooperation or a cooperative element to it. If we go down and we see on the bottom left the circle that says discourse, we can see that it is cooperative. People are adding value, but fortunately, because it's only one way, only one person is adding the value. And so again, this is the way we think about that is just a sender transmits something to the receiver. And I know what you're thinking, Carol, you told us that's not the way communication happens in like week 1 or 2. It's just not possible because there's nonverbal and verbal communication. So we are always sending and receiving. True. The way I would think about discourse would be not necessarily that just a sender is sending information to a receiver, but think about when you sit in a class, maybe a lecture class that's like full-on lecture, like a bio or a chem. I'm sure you guys have amazing activities as well, but during the lecture part, not the lab, usually the instructor's transmitting information to people, a large group of people who don't generally, it's not ongoing, like a dialogue would be. You can think of that maybe as more of a discourse. If we go over to the right-hand side, and at the very bottom, there's something called a diatribe. And as you can see, that is one-way communication that is also competitive. I just did like one of these, that was not meant to be a religious thing. That's just where the circles fall. A diatribe is when we have one person being very competitive and kind of dominating the conversation. And so the description here is browbeating, those who disagree, and or inspiring others with the same perspective. Browbeating just means I'm going to impose my thoughts on you and tell you either do what I want, think what I want, or just stop me from talking. They just want to hear themselves talk and try to make you believe what they believe. That's when somebody's on a diatribe, that's what's happening. They're trying to come at you, basically. And then we have, if we go up to the top right quadrant, we see it's actually called a debate. When both people are involved, but for the purposes of being competitive, communicating competitively, that's called a debate. Now, this is talking about an argument or persuading somebody. Yes, in some cases, if it's a set up professional or formal debate, there's a lot of respect that goes into that. So while it's competitive, it's still respectful. But unfortunately, in our everyday lives, we see a lot of debate where both sides that are engaging are not very respectful. So you as a communicator could look at this visual and decide, how do I want others to see me? And if I want to be seen as somebody who gets along well with others, the dialogue is what we want to try to engage in more often. Then we're going to transition over to something called self-disclosure. You could probably figure out what this means by the term itself, but it's the act of verbally or non-verbally revealing information about yourself to others. I say verbally or non-verbally because, like, we're looking at an image here of a girl, what seems like a girl with her arms folded and a kind of a smirk on her face. So even though she's not saying anything, there's no verbal communication, her nonverbal is still communicating something. So if I was like, so are you enjoying your new job? And she made that face, I would be like, she does not love her new job. Ironically, as I'm talking about this, I look up and I see my cat, Addie. She's just sort of looking down on me from her cat tower, like, what are you doing? She is not self-disclosing just because she doesn't have the opportunity to verbally share. I guess we could think about it if we think about nonverbal communication also discloses. However, I did preface our first chapter saying we're going to primarily think about human communication. When it comes to self-disclosure with people, there's something called an expectation violation theory. It's when whoops, hold on one second. I need to have a drink because I felt like my voice was just going to cut out. So what happens when someone violates, well, they're asking the question, what happens when someone violates a norm within interpersonal interaction? The other person will subsequently view the interaction negatively. And then the nature of relationship impacts the likelihood of individuals overlooking those violations. So let me explain what that means. We have socially a set of expectations around what's the appropriate amount of self-disclosure and what's not. And so, for example, if we're in the line at, let's say, Fry's, it's normal to talk about like, hey, it's cold, unusually cold today, right? Or like, hey, great shoes. I mean, I make conversation all the time with everybody. That would be acceptable in most cases. Not everybody responds well to that. But what is definitely not acceptable, I think, or expected of others is for me to be next to somebody in line at Fry's and say, hey, so like, how old were you when you decided to have kids? That's not a usual conversation to ask somebody I don't know. So, or for me to disclose myself to say, to turn around and go, well, this line is crazy, right? Yeah, so I was 17 when I decided to have kids. That's not usual, either to ask somebody or to share that. That would be like an expectancy violation. And so that person and I don't have a relationship, so that person would probably just think I was weird. But if we were friends or getting to know each other and I overstepped and was self-disclosing way before it was time, other people could see that as off-putting, and maybe make this face or maybe walk away from me or stop calling me. We can generally tell when we have overstepped or overshared by the way people respond non-verbally. They won't always say like, whoa, too much too soon. If they do, great, and then we know, but usually their nonverbal communication tells us. We also have something called impression management, which I always like to talk about, particularly at this day and age. When I was in college, we didn't have social media, so we didn't have an online persona to manage. But there is something our book talks about in terms of called impression management. That's when we present ourselves in a certain way to generate the most favorable impression of ourselves in the eyes of others. I just saw I'm not gonna lie, it was a YouTube reel, or it was a video because it was probably like 10 minutes. And a woman was picking out pictures that were unflattering of celebrities. And they were like, oh, Beyonce's Beehive is gonna come after me for this. And there's the Kate Middleton one, and all the Kardashians, basically. And people were pointing out all the flaws, like, hello, you photoshopped this, you made yourself look like half the person you actually are. And of course, the celebrities are like, no, I don't know what you mean. That's impression management. When we try to post an image or say things, we're making efforts to get people to believe something other than what's true, or even or it's a better version. That's impression management. A persona is when we have a face or put on a front in social situations, which could be online or in person. And you guys have probably heard of that. What persona are we getting from her today? We're getting the, living my best life persona, which may or may not be true. The next word is not actually a facade. It's called a facade. You've probably heard that word, but maybe didn't know how it was spelled. That's when we have a false appearance hiding what someone is really like. So you may have heard them say they're hiding behind a facade of luxury. Not really. If you really get to know them, you see there's that woman who Anna something or other who made everybody believe she was a millionaire or something. She was definitely hiding behind a facade of like wealth, but she just kept like going and hanging out with famous people, and other people were giving her money. And I don't really remember the whole story, but that's what a facade is. Then we talk about something I like to talk about, again, it's called the social penetration theory, which gives us, if you will, kind of a guide. If you're not sure, like, I don't know, Carol, how much self-disclosure is too much? Well, we have a guide. Our authors talk about stages of the theory, and we can think about it in terms of like step by step, if you will. One would be, again, an orientation stage. That's like when you are at the outer edge of an onion. With an onion, I should back up and say you have to kind of peel from the outside and work your way in, right? On the outside, when you're just holding an onion at the store, you're not crying or anything. So that helps you think about like, okay, at the outer edges of this onion, or the very beginning stages of relationship development, there's very little depth or breadth of topics and disclosure. So there's hardly any emotions, just like at the center of the onion. We haven't really dug into anything yet. And then we can go into exploratory, where we start sharing, basic things about ourselves. The affective stage is when we start sharing maybe more emotions, getting a little more vulnerable. The stable stage is when you're starting to get to much closer to the center of the onion, which is to say, not only have I started sharing intimate things, but I'm getting more comfortable doing so. And then the deep penetration stage would be like when you're at the heart of it, and feeling like all the things about me. I can think of a really funny clip, but it's kind of gross, so I won't share it, from the movie, where he's like, wow, you're doing this thing with me watching. Feel like that shouldn't be happening. So it's when you're like definitely close enough where you definitely have your guard down, because you have built the self-disclosure, which through the depth of your topics, which is like, how often are you talking? And then the breadth of your topic, which is also like, what kinds of things are you talking about? As you talk more about very personal things, which happens over time, we don't want to just, again, dig into like the really personal things at the beginning. We become closer to people. So self-disclosure can be used to strengthen relationships, for sure. Then we have something called the Johari window. I think if you've taken psychology, you've probably heard of this. Obviously, it came up. I shouldn't say obviously. If you took Communication 100, it comes up there as well, because it's a general, common research term that we talk about. It's when we start thinking about ourselves. And again, we've got this four quadrant situation. On the left side of the quadrant is how much other people know about us. And on the top, it's a spectrum of how well do we know ourselves. So again, starting at the top left, we refer to this as the open self, when we know ourselves really well and other people know us really well. I'm going to give you a caveat, which is to say, hopefully appropriately. This doesn't mean too much information. Again, with self-disclosure, there is a possibility of too much. But we would think about the open self as somebody like an open book. I know a lot about myself, and I'm open to sharing it, maybe in the right circumstances, is what we would say. If we stay on the left side, on the bottom is called the hidden self. So we know ourselves, but we don't share that with other people. Maybe there's something about us that we don't want other people to know. I mean, I think most of us can relate to that. So there's a piece of us that is hidden from other people. Then if we go to the bottom right quadrant, the unknown self is kind of like how it sounds, which is, I don't know myself very well, and as a result, other people don't know me very well. I think when you don't know yourself very well, the only way out of that, if you're interested in getting out of that, is to start really paying attention to who are you, what's important to you, what do you value, what do you want from other people, like the runaway bride. We could say she was very much in her unknown self because she didn't even know what kind of eggs she liked. And therefore, that person she was going to marry, they really didn't truly know her. They only knew the part of her that she was showing them, which wasn't a true person until, spoiler alert, until she decides to marry Richard Gere. I'm not going to tell you the rest of the movie because I'm probably going to watch it, but still, that's what happens. And then we have a blind self, which again is maybe I don't know parts of myself, but other people have figured it out. And maybe this is something like, maybe I have an anger issue, or maybe I'm just impatient with certain people, or maybe it could be something really positive. Maybe I don't realize that I am super patient, but other people can see that about me. So the Johari window would say we have different selves that we're in at different moments of time. I'm not going to argue that we should all try to work to be in the open self all the time, because I don't think we have to share everything with everybody. But I do think there's tremendous value in working to know ourselves. So like the open self and the hidden self, those are, at least we know who we are. There's probably some value in that, because again, the better we know ourselves, the more we can proactively take steps towards happiness based on either recognizing what's already great, or if there's something we're not happy about, we can do take steps to improve it for ourselves. Okay, so then we get into the difference between hearing and listening. And the short way to describe this is hearing is the actual sound that's coming in through your ears. Can you or can't you hear somebody as a physical thing? Some can and some can't, but that's more about, again, physical sounds coming through the ears. Whereas listening, you want to think about as a process, and you want to also think about it as an active process. Our book talks about it as a complex psychological process, and that's because there's thinking involved generally. For example, you might think of an example I hear all the time from students is like, oh, my parents are always asking me to take out the trash, or quite honestly, husbands tell me that, oh, my wife is always asking me to take out the trash, but she already knows that I've heard it before. She doesn't have to ask. But then the women in the room are like, yeah, I have to keep asking because you don't just do it on your own, which I always think is funny. But for example, whether it's a parent, a partner, what have you, if the person's tone says, hey, listen, I don't want to keep asking you about this, but the trash is full and you walked right by it, they might say, can you take the trash out? And if you're an active listener, you heard both the sounds that were being processed from the verbal messages, the words, and you're also picking up on, you're thinking about, oh man, she sounds upset or he sounds upset. I should probably go take the trash out. If you're not being an active listener and you're just letting the sound kind of wash over you, you might be in for a surprise. Meaning that the other person, if they don't feel like they're being listened to, might say, oh, I'm going to take the trash out and I'm going to put it right in your room for you because you weren't listening to me. That's maybe, hopefully, a hypothetical that never happens to any of you. But again, an active listener would also pay attention to things like the tone, the volume, pay attention to the nonverbals of like the gesture, the eye contact, how's the person standing, that kind of thing. Which moves us into a more involved level of listening, which is critical listening. We do this to make sure, or to decide if the message makes sense. We can think of critical as thorough as opposed to negative. For being a critical listener, we are really trying to pay attention. If we were in class, I would ask you, like, what's a good example of a time when you would want to be a critical listener? Essentially, the answer I would come up with that is, if the situation is important and or the person is important to you, then it's probably a good idea to be a critical listener. Our book also talks about the listening process, and if you're keeping track of slides, we are almost done. This is the Hurrier model, and that's because the Hurrier represents the first letters of each step in the model. So our model would say, first we have hearing. Again, there's attending or paying attention to some kind of sound. Then we're going to try to understand it, which means, like, do I understand the actual words? Yes or no. 3 is remembering. Can I recall what was actually said to me? That's a part of listening. If I can't remember, I probably was not active listening. 4 would be, okay, I can remember this thing. Now I'm going to interpret it, which is what I was talking about earlier with critical listening. It says attending to various factors influencing the message. So attending is paying attention to the other things that are going on in addition to the verbal words. How can I interpret this? I interpret this to mean she's happy, she's sad, he is in a hurry, he doesn't want me to do that, even though the words say one thing. I'm interpreting based on everything else. And then based on what I interpret the message coming at me, I'm going to judge what I think, like, okay, collectively, here's what I think this means. I should probably then get off my butt and go do the thing, or I should stop talking maybe and listen a little bit more. I'm going to evaluate if there's action for me to take, what I need to do, what maybe this person's looking for, what are the needs. And sometimes if you're not sure, it's great question to say, what do you need from me right now? Especially if you are in a dynamic where you feel like you're always unsure of what to do, just ask. If your partner or a boss, whatever, is starting to talk to you and you aren't sure what to do, you can say, what do you need from me in this situation? Are you wanting for me to listen for advice? Are you wanting me to just listen empathically? How can I support you right now? That way you know what you're doing. And then the last step of the listening process would be responding, assuming you took everything else into consideration. I think most people who are talking is for the purpose of being listened to. And so, again, if you ask this question, you'll know if they want a response or not. Oftentimes we do, but I have a family member who always calls people on this person's drive home from work and actually doesn't want a response. I know because I asked this person after years of it happening. I said, hey, so do you want me to respond? And that person was like, not really, because I found myself for like a 20-minute conversation just going, oh, what? Oh. And then as I would try to respond, the person would just talk over me and keep going. So eventually I'm like, ding, ding, ding. Let me just ask, are you looking for a response here? And that person just said, no. So then I knew he or she is just looking to vent. As far as listening goes, there are types of listening. Silent listening was where you say nothing. That can be used to convey, I'm happy with you, I'm sad with you, I'm attentively listening. You can use it as you need to, but I will say, as far as a healthy relationship goes, this one is best used when it's used for the good, which is I'm really trying to pay attention, so I'm silently listening. Questioning, of course, just like it sounds, which means you're asking questions so that you understand, like, hey, so when you said this happened, did you mean like intentionally, or you're just asking clarifying questions? Paraphrasing helps to summarize the facts. I want to take a moment. This is just a personal thing. I dated somebody one time whose interpersonal, we dated after college, but apparently when he was in college, his interpersonal communication instructor told him to parrot everything. And so I would say something like, I'm a little bit unhappy about something that happened today. And he would say, you're unhappy about something that happened today. And I would say, yeah, because it isn't what we talked about. We talked about blah, blah, blah. And he would, you think it's not what we talked about. We talked about this other thing. And it made me super upset. It's like, what are you doing? It's so frustrating. Now, that's just my take. And so it was a good opportunity for us to talk through that and say, that is not the kind of listening that I enjoy. In fact, it makes me uneasy because it sounds like you're not listening. It sounds like you're just literally repeating. So maybe have that conversation of what kind of listening somebody would like you to do. I personally don't love the parroting, which our book doesn't talk about, but paraphrasing gets a little close to that. Paraphrasing could be used at the end, which especially in work, if you're talking to a boss, I think it's probably a good strategy to say, okay, so if I heard you correctly, you want me to wait on this task for Friday, but go ahead and bump this other thing up so that we can get it done in advance. Does that sound right? Especially if you have a boss who seems to always change his or her mind, paraphrasing might be helpful. But line by line parroting, I don't think is what most people prefer. Empathizing, though, is when you are really trying to listen to how the other person feels without passing judgment. I don't know if you guys have seen that. Maybe it's a TikTok challenge because everything is, oh, there's Addie. She's trying to be in the shot. Turkey. Have you guys heard the phrase or the TikTok, we listen and we don't judge? I love that one because it's usually partners who have things they want to say. And because they did it under the guise of that activity, they let each other off the hook, it seems. But empathizing is when you're trying to connect with that person. And that can be, of course, incredibly valuable. We also have supporting, which is similar. You offer agreement. You might offer praise or reassurance, which is you're sort of communicating, not necessarily I'm empathizing that I've been there, but like I'm here for you is what we're doing when we're supporting. Analyzing, somebody might want you to help problem solve. So you might analyze, okay, based on what you've said, here's what I think a good solution might be. Versus evaluating, this is one where it's best if that's what the speaker asked you for. And sometimes some of us don't want other people to solve our problems. We just want them to listen to us and offer support. So use that one with judgment, like, oh, but that's horrible. You should quit your job. If you say that to me after I've just sort of said I want to work through this problem, it sounds like you didn't actually listen to me, right? So it's best to ask about that one. And then same is true probably with advising, which is the other person or you, depending on who's doing the advising, offering information about maybe next steps, not necessarily offering judgment, but offering solutions. Not everybody wants those solutions. So those are all the different types of listenings. We talked about the types of conversations, self-disclosure, social penetration theory, as well as the Johari window, the listening process, and the types of listening responses. I hope that that was helpful. I'll see you guys soon.